The next or third stage of the progress of Masonry, represented by the master's degree, commenced at the advent of Christianity. As Hutchinson, in his description of the two preceding progressive classes of Masons, had assigned to the first, as represented by the apprentices, only the knowledge of the God of nature, as it prevailed in the earliest ages of the world, and to the second, as represented by the fellow crafts, the further knowledge of God as revealed in the Mosaic legation, so to this third stage, as represented by Master Masons, he had assigned the complete and perfect knowledge of God as revealed in the Christian dispensation. Masonry is thus made by him to assume in this third stage of its progressive growth a purely Christian character. The introduction of rites and ceremonies under the Jewish law, which had been derived from the neighboring heathen nations, had clouded and obscured the service of God, and consequently corrupted the second stage of Masonry, as established by Moses and followed by Solomon. God, perceiving the ruin which was overwhelming mankind by this pollution of his ordinances and laws, devised a new scheme for redeeming his creatures from the errors into which they had fallen. And this scheme was typified in the third or master's stage in the progressive course of Masonry. Hence, the master's degree is, in this theory, exclusively a Christian invention. The legend receives a purely Christian interpretation, and the allegory of Hiram Abiff is made to refer to the death or abolition of the Jewish law and the establishment of the new dispensation under Jesus Christ. A few citations from the language of Hutchinson will place this theory very clearly before the reader. Footnote. They are taken from Spirit of Masonry, Lecture 9. The death and burial of the master builder and the consequent loss of the true word are thus applied to the Christian dispensation. Piety, which had planned the temple at Jerusalem, was expunged. Footnote. The master is slain. The reverence and adoration due to the divinity was buried in the filth and rubbish of the world. Footnote. Burial and concealment in the rubbish of the temple first, and then in an obscure grave. Persecution had dispersed the few who retained their obedience. Footnote. The confusion and consternation of the craft. And the name of the true God was almost lost and forgotten among men. Footnote. The master's word is lost. In this situation, it might well be said that the guide to heaven was lost, and the master of the works of righteousness was smitten. Footnote. In the 18th century, it was supposed by an incorrect translation of the Hebrew that the substitute word signified the master is smitten. Dr. Oliver adopted that interpretation. Again, true religion was fled. Those who sought her through the wisdom of the ancients were not able to raise her. She eluded the grasp, and their polluted hands were stretched forth in vain for her restoration. Footnote. By the wisdom of the ancients is meant the two preceding stages of Masonry, represented, as we have seen, by the apprentices and the fellow craft. In the allegory of Hiram, the knowledge of each of these degrees is unsuccessfully applied to effect the raising. Finally, he explains the allegory of the third degree as directly referring to Christ in the following words: "The great Father of all, commiserating the miseries of the world, sent his only Son, who was innocence." Footnote. Acacia, the Greek word akakia, means innocence. Hence, in the succeeding paragraph, he calls Masons true Acacians. Itself to teach the doctrine of salvation, by whom man was raised from the death of sin unto the life of righteousness, from the tomb of corruption unto the chambers of hope, from the darkness of despair to the celestial beams of faith. And finally, that there may be no doubt of his theory that the third degree was altogether Christian in its origin and design, he explicitly says, "Thus the Master Mason represents a man under the Christian doctrine, saved from the grave of iniquity and raised to the faith of salvation, as the great testimonial that we are risen from the state of corruption. We bear the emblem of the Holy Trinity as the insignia of our vows and of the origin of the Master's order." Footnote. Spirit of Masonry, Lecture 9, page 100. The Christianization of the third or Master's degree, that is, the interpretation of its symbols as referring to Christ into Christian dogmas, is not peculiar to nor original with Hutchinson. It was the accepted doctrine of almost all his contemporaries, and several of the rituals of the 18th century contain unmistakable traces of it. It was not, indeed, until the revisal of the lectures by Dr. Hemming in 1813 that all references in them to Christianity were expunged. Even as late as the middle of the 19th century, Dr. Oliver had explicitly declared that if he had not been fully convinced that Freemasonry is a system of Christian ethics, that it contributes its aid to point the way to the Grand Lodge above, through the cross of Christ, he should never have been found among the number of its advocates. Footnote. Antiquities of Masonry, Chapter 6, page 166. Note. Notwithstanding that the Grand Lodge of England had authoritatively declared in the year 1723 that Masonry required a belief only in that religion in which all men agree. Footnote. Book of Constitutions, first edition, Charges of a Freemason, 1. The tendency among all our early writers after the revival of 1717 was to Christianize the institution. The interpretation of the symbols of Freemasonry from a Christian point of view was, therefore, at the period when Hutchinson advanced his theory, neither novel to the craft nor peculiar to him. The peculiarity and novelty of his doctrine consisted not in its Christian interpretation of the symbols, but in the view that he has taken of the origin and historical value of the legend of the third degree. At least from the time of Anderson and de Guiler's, the legend of Hiram Abiff had been accepted by the craft as an historical statement of an event that had actually occurred. Even the most skeptical writers of the present day receive it as a myth which possibly has been founded upon events that have been distorted in their passage down the stream of tradition. Now, neither of these views appears to have been entertained by Hutchinson. We look in vain throughout his work for any reference to the legend as connected with Hiram Abiff. In his lecture on the Temple at Jerusalem, in which he gives the details of the labors of Solomon in the construction of that edifice, the name of Hiram does not once occur, except in the extracts that he makes from the Book of Kings and the Antiquities of Josephus. Indeed, we must infer that he did not recognize Hiram Abiff as a Mason, for he expressly says that all the Masons at the temple were Israelites and believers in the Jewish faith. In a subsequent lecture on the secrecy of Masons, he, in fact, undervalues Hiram Abiff as an architect and says that he does not doubt that Hiram's knowledge was in the business of a statuary and painter, and that he made graven images of stone and wood, and molten images in metals, thus placing him in a subordinate position, and completely ignoring the rank given to him in all the Masonic rituals, as the equal and colleague of Solomon and the master builder of the temple. Footnote: Hutchinson has here ventured on a truth, which, however, none of his successors have accepted. See hereafter the chapter in this work on the legend of Hiram Abiff, in which I have advanced and endeavored to sustain the same view of the character of this celebrated artist. There is nowhere to be found in the work of Hutchinson any reference, however remote, to the circumstances of the death and raising of the widow's son. He must have been acquainted with the legend, since it was preserved and taught in the lodges that he visited. But he speaks, in the most general terms, of the third degree as symbolizing the corruption and death of religion, and the moral resurrection of man in the new Christian doctrine. If he believed in the truth of his own theory, and we are bound to suppose that he did, then he could not but have looked upon the details of the master's legend as absolutely false, for the legend and the theory can in no way be reconciled. If I rightly understand the language of Hutchinson, which, it must be admitted, is sometimes confused, and the ideas are not plainly expressed, he denies the existence of the third degree at the temple,